So, as mentioned, our first panel today, Influencers Reshaping Diplomacy, is a sort of introduction to the many ways in which influencers and influencer practices have become entangled with diplomatic issues. We are joined by 5 presenters whose work will explore this topic across distinct contexts. And I'm also aware that many of our presenters in this panel are joining us from the Americas, where it's quite late. So I would also like to thank them for their generous scheduling accommodations. And now let us warmly welcome our first presenter, John BESSAI. John, the screen is yours.
Speaking from Alexandria, Ontario, I acknowledge the traditional territory of Haudenosaunee, including Mohawk and St. Lawrence Iroquois peoples, and Huron-Wendat peoples, land covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Respect goes to elders past and present, and respect also goes to the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose country Curtin University stands. Public cultural institutions now communicate through creator-like forms. Platformed voice, compact storytelling, serial circulation, and guided participation shape that communication. These forms organize public attention, public feeling, and public trust. Canadian cultural institutions offer a strong field for examining this development because public institutions in Canada carry explicit mandates around memory, access, education, and civic narration. Influencer diplomacy names a broad field shaped by platform visibility, creator culture, and digital circulation. Soft power names the attractive effect generated through culture, credibility, and persuasion. Creatorly diplomacy names a narrower institutional practice, creator-like institutional public address that organizes trust, relation, and visibility. Public code names the procedural layer that structures that address through sequence, access, metadata, credits, pedagogy, and preservation. Together, these terms specify the field, the effect, the communicative mode, and the procedural infrastructure. Public code gives analytic precision to institutional style. The term refers to the procedural layer of institutional encounter. It includes sequence, metadata, credits, permission, access, pedagogy, and preservation. Sequence shapes pace. Credits disclose relation. Metadata shapes searchability. Access structures movement through a work. Pedagogy and preservation carry institutional afterlife. Public code, therefore, helps explain how institutions arrange proximity and credibility while preserving authority, responsibility, and memory. Canada offers a concentrated field for this analysis. Public institutions in Canada mediate Indigenous settler relations, multiculturalism, environmental governance, and public memory. Those institutions include the National Film Board of Canada, museums, public broadcasters, heritage platforms, and educational interfaces. Public mandates keep accountability, accessibility, pedagogy, and narration visible. Public mandates also keep institutional contradiction visible. The Canadian case therefore shows how public service media adopt contemporary vernaculars while retaining records of collaboration. The National Film Board of Canada provides concentrated examples. Badabun First Light places participants in a future Toronto reshaped by Indigenous language presence, transformed civic space, and guided movement through an altered urban environment. The work centers language revitalization, Indigenous futurity, and the reimagining of municipal space. Bear 71 places participants within a monitored wilderness structured by tracking systems, surveillance cameras, ecological data, and the narrated perspective of a grizzly bear moving through Banff National Park. The work centers human intrusion, animal life, and environmental governance. Do Not Track places users inside the everyday operations of online profiling, browser surveillance, targeted advertising, and digital identity formation. The work centers personal data extraction, algorithmic visibility, and the pedagogical exposure of tracking systems. These works circulate through public institutional channels, production credits, interface pathways, deployment practices, exhibition histories, and educator materials shape each encounter. The NFB offers a visible institutional forum through which creatorly diplomacy and public code become legible together. The three projects present distinct public problems through distinct media environments. Dennyfher's Light presents Indigenous language presence, urban transformation, and civic reimagination within a future Toronto. Bear 71 presents ecological monitoring, surveillance, and more than human life within a digitally mediated wilderness. And Do Not Track presents browser surveillance, data profiling, and online visibility within the ordinary routines of digital life. Across these projects, public institutions use immersive, interactive, and platformed forms while carrying pedagogical, archival, and interpretive responsibility. Museums and memorial platforms use concise labels, layering, naming, testimony, audio guides, digital wayfinding, and design interpretation. Public media and heritage campaigns use conversational authority, short-form explanation, repeatable clips, shareable fragments, and familiarity through form. Institutional credibility grows through curation, pacing, and designed proximity. Institutions also maintain obligations to record-keeping, public access, and educational transfer. Creatorly diplomacy, therefore, extends beyond one institution and describes a broader public cultural condition. Public code reveals 6 institutional operations: entry conditions, sequence and pace, credits and protocols, metadata and classification, preservation and archival, afterlife, and pedagogical transfer. Each operation structures public encounter. Cultural institutions communicate through message and through procedure. A public encounter begins before a viewer clicks, enters, or listens. Access design, title language, platform compatibility, public deployment, and maintenance choices already structure the relation. Diplomatic effect grows through this chain of institutional decisions. 4 claims follow from this account. Public cultural institutions belong within the broader field of influencer diplomacy. Creator-like authenticity operates as an institutional technique built through design, voice, documentation, and public obligation. Interface, access, metadata, and preservation function as diplomatic infrastructure. This vocabulary supports comparative work across media history, cultural policy, communication studies, and public interest technology. Public institutions remain visible here as active participants in contemporary diplomatic life. Creator-like form now shapes public cultural communication in ways that connect institutional practice with platform vernacular. Soft power identifies the attractive effect. Creatorly diplomacy identifies the institutional communicative mode through which public institutions organize trust, relation, and visibility. Public code clarifies how that mode works through sequence, access, credits, metadata, pedagogy, and preservation. The Canadian case shows how creator-like form carries archival responsibility, pedagogical intention, and civic obligation in the same encounter. Public cultural institutions participate in contemporary diplomatic life through designed relation, public narration, and durable circulation. Thank you.
So thank you, and good night or good morning. My name is Larissa MOURA. I'm a PhD candidate in media studies at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte in Brazil. And now I'm currently visit student at Faculty of Information at the U of T here in Toronto, Canada. I conducted this study with my supervisor, Professor Janaíne Aires, from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And today I will talking about how influencers mediate global cultural narratives, focusing on Brazil and Canada. In February 2026, Bad Bunny, a Puerto Rican artist, performed at the Super Bowl, one of the most watched events in the United States with approximately 135 million viewers. But this wasn't just a musical performance, it became a global cultural and political moment, especially in the USA. One example is that this was the first show of the event exclusively in another language, in this case in Spanish, at a time when the government was implementing one of the stricter policies against immigrants. In retaliation, Trump supporters attempted a boycott, such as alternative show streamed on YouTube in the same time. One of the main messages of the show was the idea that we are all American. This challenges a common assumption that America means only the United States, but this idea did not happen by accident. Historically, the United States has positioned itself as the representative of America, especially towards its political and economic power in the continent. These include processes like economic influence, cultural dominance, and foreign policy strategies that reinforce the idea that America refers mainly to the USA. As a result, other countries in the continent, especially in Latin America, are often symbolically excluded from this identity. So the question becomes, who gets to define America, or who belongs to America? After the event, influencers from different countries started reacting to the performance, but they were not just reacting. They were interpreting, translating, and reshaping the meaning of the event for their audience. Recent studies show that influencers are becoming important actors in political and cultural communication. They can act as what we call narratives, entrepreneurs, meaning they help shape how people understand global events. In this paper, I argue that influencer diplomacy should be understood as a form of cultural mediation. Starting from the argument that influencers not only comment on global cultural events, but also perform a work cultural mediation conditioned by platforms' logics, this article seeks to answer the following question. How do influencers transform globally circulating cultural events into local meaningful narratives in different national contexts? And how do platform dynamics shape this process? So my objectives is the first to analyze how influencers interpret, frame, and locate global cultural narratives for the audience, consider the difference between the Brazilian context and Canada. And second, to examine how the logics of visibility, formats, and metrics of digital platforms condition the production, circulation, and amplification of these interpretations. In my methodology, to explore this, I conducted a qualitative comparative analysis. I analyzed posts from 8 influencers, 4 from Brazil and 4 from Canada. These posts were collected from TikTok, Instagram, and X in these days following the event. And from the initial set, the context was selected based on 3 criteria. The first, high level of engagement, like include views, comment, and shares. The second, representation of different content styles. And finally, relevance to debate surround the event. A publication when each the creator's nationality was not clearly identified were not relevant to the objective of analysis were excluded. So the best part, the analysis. To guide the analysis, I organized the data in 6 categories. First, event translation, which looks at how influencers explain or interpret the event. Second, identify construction, focusing on how the idea of America is defined or negotiated. Third, locations or narratives, which shows how content is adapted to a specific audience. And then discursive framing, meaning the dominant way the event is interpreted. Fifth, language strategies, which examine how the discourse is constructed. And finally, platform logic, the most important part, I think, looking at how formats and platforms features influences meaning. Together, this helps us to understand how influencers interpret and reshape the events. Here we have 4 examples from Canada. The first influence, I call it Influence A, reacted to mention of Canada in the show using humor, performing a hybrid identity with a Spanish accent. For example, she told in the video, I'm from Canada, Toronto, Ontario, com Spanish accent. Influence B adopts an ironic tone, presents himself as an old white man while expressing solidarity with a broader idea of America. The influence C engages with the idea of belonging, reacting to become called snow Latinos, and framing in an affective and humorous way. And the influence D offers a more explicit political interpretation, discusses the idea of America as a contested identity, and criticize how Canada positions itself in relation to it. And in Brazilian context, here we have 4 examples from Brazil. The influence E provides the tiled explanation of the performance, unpack cultural reference and symbols from the show. I think this video has 10 minutes around. Influence F offers a critical reflection on Brazil identity, discussing how Brazil relates to Latin America and how this was highlighted by the performance. And the third influence in the screen, the influence G frames the event as a broader political message, used it to reflect on ideological divisions and social tensions. And the last influence H presents a more structural political analysis connected to the performance to historical and geopolitical dynamics in the Americas. So now comparing both contexts, we can see 2 different modes of mediation. In Canada, influencers tend to use more implicit and affective forms of translation, often really humor, identify performance, and share a cultural reference. And in Brazil, on the other hand, influencers tend to adopt a more explicit and interpretative approach, providing explanations and engaging in political and cultural critique. However, there are also important similarities. In both contexts, influencers actively localize the events, connect into national identities, and make it meaningful for the audience. They also frequently use political framing, showing that this was not just internment, but a moment of symbolic and ideological negotiation. And finally, both operate on the strong platforms logics, especially in terms of timing, format, and visibility. So overall, what we see is that influencer diplomacy is not fixed practice. It varies across contexts, but is always shaped by cultural position and platform dynamics. It's my last slide. I think I don't have more time. So what can we learn from this? Influencers are not just content creators. They are cultural intermediaries who translate global events into local meanings. This also shows that diplomacy today is not only done by governments, it is distributed across platforms and shaped by digital actors. Thanks so much for this opportunity. I'd be happy to continue the discussion.
Okay, Yeah, thanks for the introduction. After two very interesting cases from Canada and Brazil, I would like to bring you all to Taiwan, an East Asian state sitting in the middle of intensifying China-US geopolitical tension. Taiwan is often discussed as a potential military conflict region or a diplomatic problem. However, I would like to approach Taiwan from a different angle, that is, as a platform environment where international politics and regional politics are explained, debated, and emotionally performed by scholars on social media platforms. So I started my research with, so I started my research with a central puzzle. That is, we are seeing more and more scholars nowadays appearing on Facebook, YouTube, and other digital platforms instead of, just saying in the classroom. So this shift illustrates what Sophie Bolship calls the influencer creep. That is, where influencer practices move beyond professional influencer and become part of other kinds of work. In this sense, academic work begins to absorb techniques of visibility, self-branding, optimization, and emotional authenticity. My project also seek to be in dialogue with the recent rise of scholar activism. For example, the concept of politically activist critical social science, that is, how scholars use their expertise, authority, and credibility to intervene in urgent political issues rather than remain detached observers. With that in mind, I asked two main questions. First, how do Taiwanese scholar influencer mobilize knowledge on social media platforms to shape public understandings of the cross-strait relations? And second, what are the roles of platform affordance and influencer tactics in this process? To answer these questions, I bring together three theoretical frameworks. First, knowledge diplomacy proposed by Jean Knight, a scholar in international academic relations. This concept helps me examine how expertise shapes relations and mutual understanding among nation states through both state and non-state actors. This approach also moved beyond a soft power model that mainly focused on attraction and persuasion. Later in my analysis, I will use the framework proposed by Jean Knight to form my comparative case studies. They include intentions and purposes, actors and partners, principles and values, modes and approaches, and finally, activities and instruments. The second concept that is related to my project is Jack Chou's idea of platform geopoliticalization. It helps me explain why Taiwan's platform debates could be linked to war, sovereignty, and national security. Chou's model goes beyond a realist and neoliberal frameworks and sees platforms as an end society, asserting the power of individual actors. However, my later analysis will show the merging of state power and individual power. Finally, we have influencer creep. This also helped me examining how scholars adapt to platform culture. And together, these frameworks allow me to conceptualize what I would call platformized knowledge diplomacy. Methodologically, I use a comparative case studies based on cross-platform digital ethnography of three Taiwanese scholars across the 5 areas I have just discussed it. And these three scholar influencer include Min Zhuzhen, a professor of political science at the National Taiwan University, Yuan Zhuzhen, a philosophy professor also at the National Taiwan University, and finally, Paul Masham, who is a criminologist and associate professor at the National Taipei University. He is also a member of the parliament in Taiwan. So let's move on to our findings. The first case, Min Zhuzhen, represents a consultancy media model. He is in partnership with Sino Insider, a US-based consultancy. So you can see from the two pictures here, the one on the top is his description of elite politics, and the one on the bottom is a 2026 track record. That is how he predicts the political development of China in this year. So from this kind of activities, we can conclude that his intention is to turn his China expertise into predictive political risk analysis centered on CCP elite politics. And on YouTube, he also creates commentary, paid memberships, and even financial and investment advisors. So his authority, although coming from the promise of prediction, we also see he is trying to decode the hidden CCP power struggle and to turn them into usable geopolitical knowledge. And by usable, it means something going beyond, politics, but maybe also related to economic, financial, and investment strategies. Second, we have Yuan Zhizhen. He represents a professor-centered public pedagogy. This is quoted from his description on YouTube. His intention is to share teaching knowledge and intellectual reflection with society. However, his actors and partners are more ambiguous. The channel is built on content shared and authorized by Yuan Zhizhen, but edited and managed by an anonymous production team. His activities include shorter and more direct, personalized YouTube and Facebook commentary across different topics. For example, from the two pictures here, you can see that he includes a recent visit to Shenzhen and also a film commentary on That to Rights, a recent film, 南京照相馆. So in this case, his authority comes from a more recognizable professor persona. He tried to portray himself as a teacher who explains and comments on contemporary issues, going beyond politics and his expertise in the philosophy of science. Finally, we Paul Mercier. He represents a scholar, legislator, civil defense mobilization. He is the founder of Kuma Academy, and from the Kuma's mission here, we will realize that his intention is to turn academic and political expertise into national security communication, especially around information warfare, fake news, and disinformation. His partners also include international organizations, for example, like the Doublethink Lab that you can see on the bottom. That is a US-facing research and policy networks on information manipulation. In this sense, he has both local and international partners, but his activities, particularly on social media, are more local. For example, on YouTube, he includes legislative questioning, policy communication, and civil defense education. So his authority comes from legislative visibility, anti-disinformation work, and also civil defense training, instead of his expertise in criminology. So here is a comparative table showing the 5 areas across the 3 scholar influencer. I don't have time to go into detail, but the table shows their different approaches, intentions, ideologies, partners, and also activities and instruments that are informed by influencer tactics. This table also help us to think about the second question about platform affordance and influencer tactics. Across the 3 cases, platform affordance do not simply distribute scholarly knowledge. They reshape it. Knowledge becomes political prediction, film review, and civil defense training material, and more. Platforms also produce different forms of legitimacy. Ming Zhizhen gains his legitimacy through political prediction. Yuan Zhizhen through a pedagogical intimacy. And finally, Paul Mercier through the National Security Authority. Their practice also showcase influencer grip in action. Optimization appears when scholars chose the most timely and platform-friendly topics, for example, like popular films, war anxiety, and other topics. However, there's no single formula because each scholar influencer addresses a different target audience shaped by their own self-branding that is related to their recognizable identity. For example, Ming Zhizhen is an analyst of CCP elite politics. Yuan Zhizhen is a professor who can interpret history and culture in easier language. And Paul Mercier is a civil defense advocate. And finally, authenticity appears when scholars show emotion, biography, and even personal struggle, making their expertise feel more intimate and trustworthy. So to conclude, through the 3 comparative cases of scholar influencer diplomats, I try to conceptualize their practice as platformized knowledge diplomacy, that is, scholar-led and platform-mediated knowledge mobilization that shapes cross-border political understanding. But we will see that actually there are a lot of tension within this normative idea, especially within the more polarized China-US geopolitical relations. Therefore, although I try to contribute by pitching international academic relations and influencer studies, there are more ways to study this influencer. For example, like to closely analyze how academic concepts are transformed into influencer style political communication, or from a audience studies perspective, what is the outcome of such platformized knowledge diplomacy? So that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Akira Keene TEOTRAKOOL. I'm an undergraduate at Grinnell College and the New Center of Research and Practice. My presentation today is called Staging the Pageant and the Border, and I'm trying to understand the concept of translation regimes and narrative inequality in the case of Thai-Cambodian influencer diplomacy. So firstly, a little bit on positionality. I'm an American-born Thai with most experience lived in Thailand. I have commitments towards anti-war and non-status commitments. However, this paper is oriented towards subordinated viewpoints or fringe comments. And so, hence, the way I analyze conflict is to look at the ways dominant translation regimes, both Thai nationalist and global North humanitarian framings, tend to render things or topics like local, partial, or inaudible in terms of translation. Hence, this presentation is more oriented towards understanding the method used to analyze influencer diplomats and understanding how these translation regimes produce narrative inequality across different legible publics. Hence, it does not advocate for a particular solution to the border conflict, and it does not endorse any political situation. So firstly, starting off with the pageant. So beauty pageants have this convention of self-parody. Think of a pageant thinking of what they wish for the world, answering earnestly, absurdly, aggressively, or sincerely. And this is exactly the quality of sincerity that makes it to the global audience rather than dismissible in terms of a silo. And so what a beauty pageant speech does is, in terms of diplomatic communication, stages a particular kind of geopolitical sentiment as an aesthetic performance, and addresses a global audience through the conventions of a feminized spectacle, and produces legibility for a conflict and cause through the carefully managed labor of a single body standing under lights. Such is the same when considering political messages produced for diplomatic contexts by influencers. So, thinking of the pageant metaphor, I want to reiterate my phrasing here. A single performance of a beauty pageant queen would address a local nationalist audience, a global cosmopolitan viewership, and internal conventions of the genre of which is influencer or TikTok or short-form videos, mapped onto different conditions that folks are managing, such as authenticity or performance. And especially when they produce something tied to their identity, for example, territorial or hierarchical conflict. And so when bringing these influencers to the front, considering the literature on influencer diplomacy so far, influencer credibility is not the property of a person, but the product of ongoing discursive work. Hence, I focus on the message and not really on case studies of influencers, and how political and promotional registers cannot be separated from the genre form itself, but also understanding the content along with the platforming of the message. Hence, content or cultural narratives that are produced fit with different types of media that are in focus at that time, XYZ. And so I look at the first main concept is narrative inequality. I look at this idea from linguistic anthropology and look at how human stories are located in asymmetrical hierarchies of credibility. They're lodged in deep, durable, and dehumanizing infrastructures of powerful historical inequality. And so this ties into this idea of, whose side are we on when thinking of sided conflict. And so groups then develop a hierarchy of narratives structured around the power of institutions, including digital media, and encompassing race, class, and gender in everyday situations. Hence, I operationalize these two research questions. how do the structural conditions of platform visibility, diasporic positioning, and nationalist pressure and audience expectation shape which narratives can achieve credibility in translation? And in addition, which kind of publics do they reach, and which versions of the conflict are rendered unheard or untranslatable in this process? Hence, the whole object of this discussion is about the narrative inequality of the influenced diplomatic messages. And so I come to this idea of translation regimes. So a translation regime, through like the pageant metaphor, in this sense already gives a performing form of diplomacy. The speech she gives, a translation regime, is a structured set of conditions through which a message is made to appear sincere, universal, and emotionally credible to the publics who have very different relationships to the political substance being narrated. Hence, I come to Susan Gao's quote here that language ideologies are regimes of value, cultural principles, and tacit presumptions about signs. Coming to this word transduction that Susan Gao used is this idea of not direct one-to-one translation, but rather an analogical transfer of social meanings across languages and media, something that is not about achieving equivalence, but about understanding the generativeness of the content and the type of discourse that is pushed further by the existence of such content. Hence, I come to this phrasing of translation regimes. I say that translation regimes are these structured conditions with these transductions occur, including these platform affordances, ideological framings, positionalities, and expectations from the audience that can shape what a message can say. Hence, when discussing ideological framings, positionalities, we would see like what would this message can say, to whom can they say it to, and what degree of credibility and effective force can it be received through. Hence, we come to these two cases where I find myself most interested in, is that the case of translating Thai, Cambodian, and Southeast Asian influencers into the Anglophone context, essentially that they are influencers of this identity, speaking English or trying to grasp the world in a way that is in the Anglophone world. And often when they speak, they have this idea that, hey, I am speaking with this message as if the entire world knows what I mean, knows what I'm speaking of. Hence, it helps with understanding this discourse further. And so, and the other side would be Asian American influencers that do not have to do translational labor. Hence, when you think of Thai domestic influencers, we would think of a nationalist framework, the pressures of Thailand's recent soft power agenda, and understanding the territorial bonds of sovereignty and Thai citizenship, while Asian Americans would focus more on diasporic distance and English language political content that are of global North digital publics and vernaculars. Hence, coming to the conflict, it is about a UNESCO heritage site which is highly contested by different histories and a big part of both of our histories. And so when discussing truisms of conflict, we think of displacement, definite injury, destruction of infrastructure, psychological harm, and border crises as a part of that type of conflict. And so why do we translate? So influencers, my assumption is that influencers are trying to translate into legible identities, legible messages, because mass media has failed to develop proper sources because of parachute journalism and many such things because of that. And so translation allows our identities to be legible to different publics. Hence, there are many ideas about fake news happening. And so with legibility, a message must be legible across attention spans, ideological frameworks, and emotional investments that are structured differently, and do so as an aesthetic performance, which aids in understanding how media in this kind of context or fringe messages are analyzed. Hence, we take this definition of the pageant seriously and analyze asymmetrical labor that rewards certain kinds of narrative with algorithmic visibility while rendering ones that are local, untranslatable, or simply unheard. And so to briefly state the premise of my paper, I use the process tracing of internet narratives, and I stitch different content into understanding how different genres of content aid each other in creating overall robust narratives. And I just so for the sake of time, I'm going to just read them out. There are techniques like stitching like putting videos that are already existing together, subtweeting on another platform that might mean mentioning a post that has been done, subtitling or dubbing, which is, you know, the paraphrasal of another type of video, commenting, giving commentary, and then lastly, mirroring that's not related to the last part at all. So this type of framework that I develop focuses on media analysis. And so lastly, the stakes of this research, why does narrative inequality in these diplomatic messages matter? So what is happening with the moral stakes is that there is a new texture or flavor of different credibilities that are to be understood, and new hierarchies of narrative power accruing on different cultural publics and cultural spaces. And with how territorial conflicts are going in the larger world as of current, America or many other places perhaps frames two-party territorial conflict as something that is polarized and can take sides. Hence, this gives in to a lot of ideas with neo-imperialism and racial capitalism. Hence, when this would go into this problem of wealth and developmental inequality on how stronger countries are more just and lesser countries are as culturally oppressed as they are. That is all. Thank you so much.
Hi, very good morning. I'm speaking from Singapore. Thanks so much for organizing this online symposium. So I'm going to share about unofficial influencers in the sense, unofficial diplomats in the sense. So we're talking about diplomacy without delegation. I'm talking about foreign, migrant, and diaspora influencers who are vernacular intermediaries in Singapore. So this is, of course, work in progress, but I'm so happy to hear some of the feedback as well. So many of my my panelists, as well as the previous framing, we kind of see that in influencers in diplomacy that there's a lot of state-sponsored influencer campaigns we talk about. There's also official government partnerships and also government agenda that's fronted through these influencers, and also a lot of high visibility geopolitical interventions that has been talked about. So whether it's disclosed or not, and many of this work also talks a lot about the domestic personal sphere in that sense. What I'm focusing on basically is about how unofficial, non-delegated, unintended creators and influencers are then talking about the country, and in that sense they become very unofficial influencers and to create a soft power for the country. So foreign residents, migrant workers, digital communities, domestic workers. So these are all very everyday platform narration, and you can also see that in that sense, I'm talking about how Singapore is a small state able to build on some of these influencers and creators that are in the scene. So why Singapore? So firstly, Singapore's total population living in Singapore is about 6 million or sort of. So in that sense, our non-residents are already like almost 1/3, and out of which the foreign workforce is also quite large, expected to be more than 1.6 million per se. So you can see that Singapore is in that sense very foreigners and migration dependent in that sense, and how we are building on our economy and our audiences and our players and our social narratives and even sociological perspectives around this diverse melting pot, so to speak. So in that sense, our official brand and Singapore being efficient has always been seen as a very economically savvy and fronting some of the policies is pretty much the reputation that Singapore has, and it's pretty much quite sensitive as well, especially with a lot of rising geopolitical tensions that we can see. So I've taken quite a different approach in the sense that I've looked at official documents, government documents and stuff, like as STB is Singapore's Tourism Board, Foreign Worker Statistics, some of the legal frameworks, the FICA, which is the Foreign Influence Countermeasures Act, and some of our election rules as well. And looking at it together like a case study on a couple of creators, which I'll share a bit more later. And contrasting that with also migrant and diaspora scholarship to understand how migrant workers use TikTok, and also domestic workers are also sharing some of this information and news about the country And then, looking at this theoretically in terms of political influencers, public diplomacy, and of course, visibility, digital labor as well. So who are these unofficial intermediaries that I'm talking about? These are some examples. One of which is actually from Yasin from Nas Daily. One of his very prolific videos actually was about Singapore, and his opening line or hook was, "I hate Singapore." And then he goes on to talk about how Singapore is efficient, how Singapore is so good in that sense. And then that kind of like put people on the edge to see like what is he really talking about. And in that video, he even had a cameo with the then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong of Singapore. So in a sense, there's a lot of aspirational governance that he kind of like showed in that video. We also have Oji-san. Oji-san is from Japan. He has YouTube videos about how simply life is lived in our heartland communities and our grassroots per se, in like very everyday, normal, no fanfare per se. We also have other expats who have relocated, and they kind of like then share their perspectives, to encourage others, and how they look at Singapore very differently, especially as expats. We also have a British TikToker who talks about lifestyle, dating culture, social norms, mistakes she has made, and in her perspective, the way that she also had friction, and how she looks at things that were affected by it as well. And then some of the less heard voices, like the migrant construction workers of South Asia or Southeast Asia native, where they are really sharing more about their experiences on TikTok, whether it's the dormitory conditions, or especially during lockdown, the difficulties and stuff that they were going through. And then also we have our Indonesian domestic workers. We have domestic workers from other Southeast Asian countries as well. But this is a large group that's on Facebook and is able to they usually like find like replacement employment and stuff. So very savvy digitally. And so they will also share about their experiences, how they see things are happening in Singapore, how do they feel like they are part of or not part of in Singapore's space. So all of which you can see that they become unofficial intermediaries in Singapore, sharing the voice about what's really happening per se. So I'll focus more on the findings and discussion from now on. So there are two key things I want to bring up. One is vernacular diplomatic labor, one of which is really about how we are translating government fronted, state-fronted diplomacy into really platform-native narrative forms across all these various boundaries. So we could see there's a translational framing about how HDB flats or things that are quite unique in public housing kind of situation, which are unique to Singapore, into something that people can really relate to and understand, and because of the framing. There's also a lot of effective calibration, especially in terms of labor, how they portray and show Singapore as efficient, very strict in terms of drug laws, but also, how there can also be certain setbacks. And it's always in comparison with their home country or another country they have lived or experienced. In that sense, so you can see there's a lot of reputational routing. And so because then the locals and other country followers will then actually share the content as well because of the comparisons and understanding. So I see this as a very vernacular diplomatic labor, vernacular because how they use the culture and diplomatic, it's quite obvious, and labor in terms of how they do the calibration. The second key thing is how I actually see stratified diplomatic legitimacy. So because of time, maybe I'll just summarize and focus that to say that some are, have high visibility and they're celebrated and they're actually kind of like really heard, but they are not all are equal because some groups are marginalized, less heard, and a lot of algorithmically a lot more limited as well. While other figures are regulated, especially in terms of political and religious speech, and eventually, how things can be asymmetric and not everything is in a sense accepted by the state per se. So in terms of theoretical contributions, you can see how I'm moving from a very contractual obligation to something that they do out of their own unofficially, and how this could exceed state orchestration and something that's organic as well. And so that shows Singapore's soft power as a small island state, and how its lived narratives actually gets amplified And of course, the asymmetric reputational. Singapore will distance itself is something that if the narrative is not so good, and if it's something that is really quite aligned to their political motives, it's something that they will celebrate and also amplify. So last few slides. So you can see that one of the things I've already pointed out, how diplomacy legitimacy is then stratified, whether people have high visibility and therefore more legitimate, and less visibility and more precarious, and some which are regulated and contested. So you can see that legitimacy is then determined by a few factors. So my last slide. So you can see that diplomacy without delegation is really talking about how unofficial creators then translate states' efforts into audience, into everyday platform narration. Their stories about food, housing is very relatable and therefore has higher impact in my view. And the soft power is increasingly infrastructural and distributed, and how some of these unofficial intermediaries are actually playing a very covert but vital role in the framing and forming of the soft powers. So lastly, thank you so much for your time. If you'd like to connect or if you have any feedback or would like to collaborate, this is my email and I can be found on LinkedIn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jed, for the presentation, and thank you to all of the presenters in this panel for such a lively and engaging start to today's symposium. We will now take a short break before our second panel begins on influencers and everyday diplomacy.